y'all, it's Mary Hyatt, and I'm so excited you're here for this month's topic, which is all about pleasure. But before we hop into today's episode, I thought I would ask, are you scared to feel it? Does it trigger you? Does it make your body tighten? Well, if you answered yes to any of those questions, you are not alone. But if you hang with me, I think I might be able to change your mind. This month, we'll explore what pleasure is, what happens when it gets repressed and turns sideways, and help you find healthy ways to embrace it in your everyday life. All right, guys, I'll see you inside this week's episode.
Welcome to the Living Fully Alive podcast with Mary Hyatt, here to help you find your authentic voice, learn how to love yourself, and embrace your life. And now, your host, life and mindset coach, body love advocate, and doTERRA presidential diamond, Mary Hyatt.
Hey guys, it's Mary, and welcome to today's second episode of our topic this month, which is all around pleasure. I am hanging out at the dining room table with my favorite and only co-host, Lindsley Brooks. Hey, girl.
Hey.
How you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing? This full moon energy still in effect?
I know. I mean, honestly, I feel pretty good.
Yeah, I'm feeling good today, too. I'm excited about our topic.
I am so excited. I was just posting on Instagram today about people going on a pleasure hunt, which is what I ended last week's episode, and sort of challenged everybody to go out and get curious about what brings them pleasure. And I, of course, have to do the same thing, because if I'm telling other people to go do it, I got to do it. So I have been on the pleasure hunt.
What have
today.
you discovered?
Well, this morning I went outside and listened to have a waterfall outside in my backyard, and listened to that this morning with a cup of, actually I went and got a latte, and honestly, there's not much more that brings me pleasure than being outside.
I know. Isn't that the truth? Especially right now. It's like just starting to like cool off a hair.
Yeah. It was like by 9:30, I was like, we're going to go
we're done.
back inside. But until then, it was just so nice, you know? And honestly, I put in some essential oils into the diffuser before you showed up. And I realized that brings me a lot of pleasure too. Just having something that smells really lovely in my home. It's just nice.
Yeah. The senses. It's always about
all the senses. Well, for those of you who didn't catch last week's episode, make sure to go back and listen to it, because it kind of opens up this conversation around pleasure. And we are going to dive a little bit deeper, because Lindsley and I, we just have a way of kind of getting into the nitty gritty of topics.
Yeah. We like the shadow side of topics.
We do, don't we? What is that about?
All the different sides. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to be talking about the shadow side of pleasure. What happens when pleasure goes wonky? What happens for us? I think especially as women, we'll sort of start with this part of the conversation about why we're so freaking afraid to experience pleasure. Because it's one thing to know the benefits. We talked about that in last episode, the benefits of why we should prioritize it. But there's something that happens. It's like, okay, we might know that, yes, we should prioritize it so that we can embrace the goodness, so that we can be human, allow ourselves to be human, that we can feel fully alive. And we're like, yeah. And then it's almost like we get met with this giant wall that comes.
Resistance. Yes.
Yeah. And we're like, I can't for so many reasons. And I want to share this quote to kind of start us off, because you and I have been doing some fun little research on this topic. But this is from a book called Women, Food, and Desire: Honor Your Cravings, Embrace Your Desires, Reclaim Your Body, by Alexandra Jameson. And she says, we have been really well conditioned to hide our cravings, especially if they're anything that has been deemed decadent or indulgent or rich. This is true in all of the really important aspects of our lives, especially those areas where pleasure is involved. We have been taught that our cravings are bad, that they're not to be trusted, and that if we indulge in them, we will become, at the very least, fat or sick, or worse, unlovable and alone. I mean, that strikes a chord for sure for me. I'm like, oh my gosh, we have, as women, this, I mean, I think we've been taught from the get-go of do not do anything that's too indulgent, that's too big. I think that's largely why we have a huge fear around being fat. We have such fat phobia, is because it's almost like it's too indulgent. If somebody's fat, it's like they've experienced too much pleasure.
Excess of pleasure.
Yes. So it's better to be thin, restricted, deprived, controlled. Ooh.
Yeah, because for some reason, pleasure can sometimes feel reckless, I guess. Like there's some idea that that you're not disciplined, or that you have there's a lack of self-control. And yet, based on what you were talking about last week, if we don't experience that very thing, if we don't allow ourselves to experience pleasure, then how ironic that the very thing we're scared to death of actually ends up bizarrely happening, which we'll probably dive into today. But if you don't do something in health, it's going to come out some other way. So
yes,
isn't that funny? We are terrified of the very thing we need.
Well, okay, so let's talk about that. The idea of a craving, the idea of, as Tara Brach would describe, the wanting self, the part of us that needs things like food and belonging and intimacy and sex and some of these elements that, again, when it gets wonky, it gets weird. But it's like we have this part of ourselves that is the craver, that is the wanting self, and yet we really fear her. Where do you think that fear comes from?
First response that comes to me is shame.
Yeah.
And when you were even saying the I want part of ourselves, there's something about even having a strong I to even want something.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so I think maybe that's at the root of all of this. There's some aspect of like, do we even believe that we're worth even being allowed to want anything? And that, why, I don't know where that comes from, right?
Well,
but that's the human condition.
Okay, so think about this. Like, there are things that we need. I'm just like processing this in real time. Like to me, and we always go back to this. I'm like, it's gotta be religion.
Yeah.
This idea of, because there's such a tie to sin here.
Yeah.
Like again, it's sort of that we can't be human. Like the urges of being human are bad. And I touched on this, and this is, I really want to go into this, but I think what the sentiment around that is, it's really the perversion of these things. Because if you think about like, when we are thirsty, we drink. When we're hungry, we eat. When we need to connect, we reach out. These are all things, but in a way, there is this shadow side where pleasure can really take on almost like this obsessive, compulsive kind of nature. And I think when we even use that word pleasure, that's what people think of. And they start getting fearful. Like, I mean, I mentioned this on the last week's podcast, but I said when we started talking about the concept of pleasure, we were like, how do we talk about this without talking about sex?
Yeah. Right.
Like we were like this, like that's what people think of. That's what people are afraid of. And we have such a weird relationship with our own sexuality as women in this culture. It's been so perverted through the pornography industry, through the shame of the church. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are contributing that. So it's like, we don't even know what it looks like to have a healthy sexuality.
Right.
And if pleasure is sort of thrown into that mix, into that basket, it's like, okay, well, how do we sort that out?
Well, yeah, because I mean, even though we said we weren't going to talk about sexuality, we're already doing it. No, but just even thinking about that, you can have a sexual experience and it not be pleasurable, right? So pleasure doesn't necessarily mean a good sexual experience. Right? But
can I get an amen?
But hey, here's what you were talking about. When you're thirsty, you drink. When you're hungry, you eat. But you know what? When you haven't had anything to drink or anything to eat in a long time, what do? You're ravenous. You're so thirsty that you literally like excess happens, right?
Yes.
So there's something that, and maybe we can explore this, but there's something about when does it become excess? When does it get out of balance? When do you get into the fringe and the shadow of pleasure? And usually it's because there's been some level of starvation or some level of something that's been disconnected or disembodied, right?
For sure.
That once you have been so starved out like that, you end up going above and beyond and just grabbing for something for that immediate fix. And usually that's done in what? Secrecy.
Yep.
And that creates shame, which just creates more of that same freaking spiral.
Well, you're so right, because I mean, I used to say that when I would overeat a lot, and I would always link it to my lack of self-care. So eating was the one time that I got to experience pleasure in a life where I was experiencing no pleasure, not taking care of myself in any way. And so when I sat down to eat, it was both trying to like fill a void that I had in my life that literally felt like it was bottomless. And then number two, it was also trying to celebrate life. Like there was a part of me that really wanted to experience pleasure, but I wasn't giving myself permission to do that in other areas of my life. So it went to that excess. It was almost like there was such a deficit in my life that I needed to sort of to the degree of the deficit was going to be the degree to which I self-indulged. And so pleasure became excessive and ultimately harmful to me and to my body. And there was a point where, because I was so ravenous, I wasn't actually enjoying it. I wasn't present with my food. I wasn't tasting it. I wasn't delighting in it. It was just like, hurry up and get as much in as I could, because it was like I was starving. And I used to describe my life that way. I would say, I feel like I'm starving.
Yes. And then when you're in that place too, what I hear you saying is you weren't able to be in the present moment.
No.
And then there's this scarcity that kicks in that says, I better get as much as I can right now for fear that I'm not going to get it again. So then all of a sudden, everything is driven from this fear-based grasping.
Yes. Well, it's this attachment, because if you think about it, I think especially with the social media pressure and all this, it's like everybody else that we see looks like they're living this happy, perfect, healthy, loving relationship kind of experience. And so when our present moment, this is kind of another side of this, when our present moment isn't what we think it should be, and it actually isn't giving us the pleasure that we think we should have, we will substitute with a different kind of quick fix pleasure. So that's actually kind of an interesting thought. Like, there's different versions of pleasure. There is the quick fix dopamine hit, which would be your alcohol, your
drug of choice,
yeah, porn, whatever. And that is a substitute for real pleasure. And I think what we're longing for is real pleasure, like the kind of long lasting pleasure which is what I talked about. I think more so, I didn't think about it this way until now, but last week, which was that kind of pleasure where you find the joy in the everyday little things, that you experience life through your senses. And so when we are disconnected from ourselves, disconnected from our bodies, disconnected from our partner, it's like this shadow side of pleasure is the substitute,
yeah,
for what we're really craving and what we're really wanting.
Well, and then, of course, that makes me think, well, when are we in that state, right? Like, because the first thought that came to mind was it's when we're in survival mode that we can't actually, I call this like looking for what brings you pleasure in your life. I would call that looking at life with soft eyes, right? It's like your peripheral vision, everything is relaxed. You're in a state of allowing and you're in a state of receiving. But when you're in hypervigilant stress mode, right? It's almost like fight or flight, survival mode is kicked in. There is a term called functional fixedness, where your eyes, it's like an animal looking something straight ahead to survive. The only thing you can see straight ahead of you is like right there. And it's like whatever you need to do to survive. So usually if you're if you're not running for your life, there's some element of our everyday where if you're just trying to survive and feel better, you're going to grasp what's right over in front of you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So then when you're in a different state physiologically in your body, you're able to relax enough that you can even allow with soft eyes a peripheral creative possibilities to even know what brings you pleasure in your everyday. What are the little ordinary things that you walked right past that day because you've been in survival mode and you didn't even know it. So it's not even, it's like, yes, it's about being present, but it's also even realizing what's going on inside of you that's keeping you in this like functional fix-itness mode of urgency and survival.
Well, and I think that ultimately there is this belief, it comes back to the shame always, that we are not enough, that we are not lovable, that there is something defective inside of ourselves, and we are unworthy of love and belonging. And so when we're feeling unloved, when we're feeling unworthy, ultimately, sort of to temporarily take away the pain of like, that's probably the harshest reality that we'll ever face. And most of us walk around with that deep wound all the time. So to temporarily take away that pain, we're going to medicate. Yeah. We are going to find a way to experience a pleasure that for a moment we get to pretend that we feel powerful, that we feel like we're in control, that we feel like we can, be a little bit high on life. And that's sort of where these addictive type things come in. But it's not just for the addict. I mean, I like to think of it, obviously I was using food for a long time for this, but I also use work. I mean, that is a total thing for me. It's like when I feel like I don't have control over my life, when I really feel like I'm not enough. Like we were just talking about this before we even got on about this comparison game that happens on social media. And when I get it, what did you call that, by the way?
Compare and despair.
Compare and despair. Yeah. Like, so when I'm in compare and despair and I'm going on that little shame cycle and spiraling really hard and really fast and really quick, then the thing that I know that will snap me out of that is let me go do something to earn my worthiness. Let me go do something to earn my lovability. Let me go do something that will give me immediate feedback in the form of likes or comments or subscribers. And I know that I can bury myself in my work, even though my work itself is really amazing and heartfelt and authentic. It can sort of take its own shadow side. I mean, I shouldn't say it can. It often does, but it really can be something where that needing to show up in a way that gets me that reinforcement.
Yeah, that
dopamine hit. All of a sudden, I'm experiencing a kind of quote unquote pleasure that's really not dressing the wound. It's really not deeply healing the wound. We're just throwing a quick Band-Aid on it.
So then would we even call that pleasure? Like maybe that's even the other question too is yes, you've been getting something out of it, but was it really actually pleasure or was it just a little, because that's maybe the definition of pleasure is something that has like sustainability. There's something that actually keeps you, it brings you back to the body, brings you back to the present moment versus like the drug high or the hit that you get. I don't know what you call that other than just a little temporary high, but I don't know. That's just something to think about.
No, I think you're right. And that's why I think that people have such fear around the word pleasure, because how we're thinking about pleasure, there's almost like we inherently know on an unconscious level that we're doing this to medicate. And maybe that's where that idea of sin comes into play. Maybe there's the shame comes into play. Like I felt like growing up in the church, there was this idea of you don't listen to your heart, the desires of your heart. I don't, sure. I don't know the Bible verse that goes into like that.
Well, you're not to be trusted. Your emotions are fickle. Your body is carnal.
Right.
So anything that has to do with coming into this body, into the senses of the body, we were told you can't trust.
Right.
It's dangerous. The devil lives there.
But it's so true. I mean, it's like, I still think that like, it's like, Even as simple as this is, the fear around enjoying a chocolate piece of cake.
Yeah.
Oh God,
Yeah.
no. It's, you know what I mean? Like, it's too decadent. It's too rich. It's too indulgent. And God forbid we enjoy
Can't
it.
control ourselves. I swear it has to be that the fear is that we will literally lose control. And yet in the same way, like I know you and I have experienced this personally. I've got clients. I even had a conversation this week with a client where she is like completely overworked. She's a full-time mama. She feels so disconnected from her body. She doesn't want to have sex with her husband, right? It's like everything about her life is just burnout mode.
Yeah.
And then she wonders why she's not feeling any passion or joy for life. Because really what we're talking about, yes, there is physical sensations when it comes to pleasure, but this is also about just feeling pleasure about life. Feeling like what your favorite term, feeling fully alive.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is if you're connected to your senses, which means you're connected to your body. And, you know, I don't know, like,
Well, no, I'm just like having this moment. It's this like connection moment where I'm going, that's the block, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if we see these things as bad, then the moment that we start opening up to life, the moment that we start feeling fully alive, we will inherently hate that part of ourselves and self-sabotage.
Yep.
Because holy cow, like that part of ourselves is not to be trusted.
Exactly.
And
we don't feel safe. Yeah.
Tara Brock, she says, desperate to get away from the pain of self-hatred, we send cruel and unforgiving messages to our wanting self. We may try to punish our wanting self by depriving ourselves of food, rest, or another person's comfort. We might so badly want to destroy the part of ourself that is wrecking our life that we recklessly injure our body and mind.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, that really is. It's like we want to destroy that part of ourselves, that
Kill
wanting
off.
part.
Yeah.
Which is why we diet. And I mentioned this last time, but I said, it's like we live on a diet of life. And there's just so much of this correlation between food and what we're talking about, because I think one of the ways that women are afraid to experience pleasure is through food. I mean, it's like we restrict, we count, we even purge. I mean, we starve ourselves literally, right? And like, if you think about the metaphor of that, starving ourselves from pleasure, restricting ourselves from what is decadent. And it's like, anytime I hear women, you know, at the dinner table and they talk about not wanting dessert, or they're going to have to work it off later if they enjoy dessert, I'm like, oh, it like makes my heart hurt so much, because I'm just thinking, you are missing out on life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a way to do that is really healthy and really beautiful. And it's honestly that idea of softness, of openness, of receiving, of receptivity is so feminine.
Absolutely. But you know what? As you're talking, I'm realizing, okay, so then what is it? Why is it so hard for us to be open or give ourselves, because what I hear you saying is giving ourselves permission to experience these types of little everyday pleasures. And there's some element where you have to feel safe in order to do that. So then my brain goes, okay, well, why don't we feel safe? And the first thing that comes to me is because I think we have a harder time with this as women. That's just my opinion.
I agree.
Okay, so I don't know. But I think on some level, there's traumas. There's
For sure. Like, and I mean, generational. And even when it comes to body things, we know that like women, we've endured sexual traumas. We've endured like disconnecting from our bodies because of the food culture. So there's some trauma, right, that has to be addressed in order to feel safe enough to even be open to receive. Because if you think about, okay, like this is an idea. You think about a child who is the epitome of openness and curiosity and playfulness, and so connected to their little bodies and their senses, and because pleasure is about being curious. Yeah. It's about being open to seeing and experiencing things. Well, there's some element of a child
knows it's safe to play when there's something there that says, when I'm done playing, I know I can go home and be with, in my safe little environment. There's a trust that they're okay. There's a trust that they can experience and play in a safe way. And as we get older,
well, and I think they have an experience. I watched this happen the other day. I was on a walk and I saw this little kid. I live near a golf course, and I was taking a walk, and this kid was rolling down the hill. And I was like, oh my God, I remember doing that as a little kid. And I just delighted in watching him because I thought, adults don't do that. Adults don't roll down hills anymore. And I just thought, when do we lose that? Like, when do we actually lose that ability to just move our bodies freely? Or like you see little girls twirling or dancing or whatever. And I just keep thinking that part of this trauma really is the shame. Like, in order for us to open up to our own pleasure, we have to make peace with the part of ourselves that is the wanting self, the part of ourself that has cravings, the part of ourself that has enjoyment and pleasure, and detach those messages that we receive. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to blame religion for this. I really, at least for me in my own journey, it came from the church. The shame came from the church of that part of ourselves is evil and bad and will lead us astray. And therefore, that part of ourselves we need to be fearful of. And what happens when we're fearful? We don't get curious. We just shut down.
Survival mode.
We avoid. Yep. We deny. We pretend it doesn't exist. And I mean, that's where you think about people who are suppressed, which I was for so long, suppress our urges. That is somebody who has a deep judgment around their desire, their craving, their need of wanting, their need of their longing. And I think that part of this journey is making peace with that part of ourselves that is yearning and longing and desiring specific things that I think are God-given to us. Hey y'all, I just wanted to interrupt this episode real quick to remind you to subscribe to this podcast. I know that emails get lost in your spam folder, so subscribing means my episodes come right to your phone. So go ahead, hit that quick little subscribe button so that you don't miss out on any of the Living Fully Alive episodes. Plus, in addition to subscribing to the podcast, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. I don't know if you know this, but I have been releasing guided meditations every Monday over on YouTube, and you're not going to hear them here. So if you've been wanting to start an easy meditation practice, subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you don't miss out on my short 15-minute guided meditations. All right, now back to this week's episode.
Well, and you and I both do a lot of work with helping people address the trauma in their bodies. And, I've noticed in my own experience and with other clients too, you teach somebody or you start introducing them to the fact that they even have trauma first, right?
Right.
And people are so terrified to address the trauma. But you know what I've noticed? That really, even acknowledging and addressing these issues that are inside there are not as scary as it is post dealing with the trauma. Like, there's two parts of I hope this is making sense, but it's like the first part is like addressing the blind spot inside of yourself. That's not as bad or as scary as you think. The scarier part is then giving yourself permission post the trauma to actually experience pleasure, be connected, like almost learning how to live again.
Well, it's becoming awake. It's waking up when you've been asleep. I mean,
that's the scarier part, it seems.
Well, I think it's because it's unfamiliar.
Yeah.
We don't know. It's like, imagine if you were deaf and all of a sudden, you're 35 years old and there's some amazing miracle cure and you're able to hear again. How almost like jarring sensory overload. And I almost feel like that's kind of what it's like when we have been instructed and trained and taught how to deprive ourselves, how to suppress our emotions, our feelings, our pleasures, our desires, our longings, all of that. As we start to open up, I mean, it's a little bit like the Pandora's box. I mean, it feels really overwhelming because all of a sudden we're seeing color, we're hearing sounds, we're tasting, we're feeling that touch. I mean, it's like, I think about just the idea of touch and somebody sensually touching you and you feeling it.
Especially after you've been, let's say, sexually traumatized, right? And touch of any kind is horrifying. So then let's say you go through the process of trying to heal that trauma. And then the newest part, or the second part of that, is allowing yourself to be touched.
Yeah.
And literally learning how to embrace that, or go into
how to
that
tolerate.
foreign yes.
It's like tolerate, even though it's quote unquote pleasurable.
Yeah.
It's like, I think about that in our life. It's like learning how to tolerate goodness and pleasure and seeing that as something that is good versus as a threat.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying too is once we've kind of moved past this survival mode and I think this is the journey of living fully alive. It's like we're walking into our aliveness. We're walking into more of a state of hopefully eventually thriving. And in order to do that, it is baby steps. It's like, okay, I can tolerate that for a minute and then I need to be done. And then I can tolerate it maybe for 5 minutes and then I'm going to be done. And over time, it's like, I remember where I was when I started this journey to where I'm at now. It's like, I don't even think about not wanting dessert. If I want dessert, I eat it. I love it. I don't even question it. Where when I started this journey, I was terrified. It was like, if I ate this bite of food, what is this going to mean? I was so fearful of experiencing the pleasure. It didn't feel like pleasurable at the time. It felt like threatening, or experiencing sex again after being, in a pretty sexless marriage. It's like, oh, I can enjoy this.
Yeah.
Oh, I can relax in this. But it was really scary. It felt really vulnerable at the beginning.
And I think that it goes back to being able to, like, do you feel safe? You know, it's like, what is that place of safety in yourself? And that's the healing work. That's the first part of everything, is like, you've got to address the blind spot, the shadow, acknowledge that there was trauma there, and then create some environment for yourself that you feel safe enough to be open to even experience new things. Because our systems, we almost have to learn how to trust ourselves and learn how to trust, I guess, the new world that you enter into. And I don't feel like anybody's talking about this. Do you? It's like everybody is so obsessed with healing trauma work, but nobody talks about the second part, which is learning how to live.
Learning how to live. I always say, like, when you are alive, when you are fully alive, and that is what my whole message, you are open, which means you're also vulnerable, which means you feel things. Like if you are alive and you're walking around and, you walk in a garden, you might have a thorn that scratches your arm. You might trip and fall. You might, it's like you are alive and awake for this life.
Yeah.
And there's pain, obviously. And I think that this sort of surrendering to that, there will be pain, but there's also the same rose bush that has a thorn and can cut your arm, also has the most incredible aroma and smell, and has the most beautiful petals. And so there's pleasure involved in living fully alive as well, but you're open, you're a little more susceptible, and that feels scary. Like when we have designed our lives to protect and to guard ourselves, and especially our hearts, it's like we have to shut everything down. And this is what you were kind of talking about your friend, like when you're in burnout mode, when we're at the point where we have to close off our bodies, close off our emotions. We don't cry, we don't laugh, we don't enjoy sex if we're even having it at all. We aren't enjoying food, we're dieting, we're restricting. I mean, everything is contracted, constricted, tight. And it's just like, so to go from that state to open.
And then we wonder why it's not working. It's like, wait a minute, I should want to have sex with my husband. I should be able to experience this chocolate cake and enjoy it. What is wrong with me?
Right.
And that nobody is talking about, that allowing yourself to feel like emotions and to feel pleasure and to tap into your senses is not easy when you have been programming yourself to shut down. It actually is a transition. And I don't know for sure, we should bring in somebody who like studies the brain, but I think from what I remember, the same parts of the brain that experience pleasure also experience pain. So it's like physiologically, there's something that we need to have compassion with ourselves for, you know, and just also being even willing to go there. And just saying, okay, so this is a process. I am willing to see how I can incorporate more of my senses into my everyday life.
Well, it's just, I think, having that patience, having that tenderness, having that gentleness, that self-compassion. Because I know for me, and this is TMI, okay? But it's so perfect. I'm like, there was a time when I would orgasm that I would burst into tears.
Yep.
Immediately. There was so much pain and trauma associated within my own sexuality. That's, you know, we're going to actually have an entire month on sexuality.
I'm looking
so
forward to that.
So we'll get into all this. I know that's a topic you and I have done a lot of work around. But I would cry. It's like the moment that I experienced pleasure, I was also accessing some deep pain.
Yep.
And so it does, and I love that you say that about the brain. It goes hand in hand. And just sort of having that gentleness, you know, with ourselves of just like, this is a process. It takes time. And, you know, when I talked about going on a pleasure hunt, you know, and getting curious, it almost sounds trite to the point where like, oh, just like go find things find your pleasure and it's all going to be fixed. It's like, no, that's just the beginning stages of starting to open yourself up to this kind of 3D living. Where we are noticing, but one of the safest ways, I think, is choosing areas to find pleasure that aren't linked to past trauma. So like a great example would be being in nature. I don't have any trauma from being in nature. I don't have any trauma from feeling wind on my skin. I don't have any trauma from laying out in the sun and feeling the warmth of sun on my skin. I don't have any trauma from going on a hike. All of those things bring me a lot of pleasure, and it's really almost effortless to experience that pleasure because it's not tied to any programming. I've never heard like you can indulge in that where to the point of it becomes sinful and shameful. So that's really easy. So I think in your own life, I think it could be like one way to baby step your way through this is to find a way to experience pleasure that isn't tied to religious shame. To find an area to experience pleasure that isn't tied to a traumatic experience. And that can be sort of like the little crack, the little open door that you can walk through that's a little bit of a gentler process before you're ready to tackle maybe something like your own sexuality, which could come with a lot of shame and a lot of trauma, or something like food that oftentimes has a lot of, you know, body shame and a lot of trauma there. So some of these other senses, smell typically doesn't have as much trauma, sight, you know, rather than the touch and the tasting, just sort of looking at some of those other senses. That just, I don't know.
I love that.
Might be a little easier.
Well, and then I was going to think too, is like, because it is about senses. It's like even becoming so self-aware that you notice which sense is being activated when, you know, it's like even getting you tuned into your senses is like, okay, which sense do I actually love to like activate the most? Do I love going places that have fabulous smells? Do I love to be in nature so that my eyes and my sight is activated? And then even being curious about like, when do I feel most attractive? When do I feel most free? Because it's a freedom. I think something about pleasure is you are in a state of freedom.
Yes.
And in that moment, there is an element of you own where you are, you're fully present in the moment. And so just even notice, like, when do I feel most alive? When do
when do I lose track of time?
Yes.
When do I laugh?
Yeah.
When am I crying? When am I feeling like, oh, I've come home? You know, haven't you ever had those moments where you're somewhere that you've never been and you're just like, this is my place?
Yes.
Or these are my people? Or I've been here before. Like that to me is an indicator. That's a clue. Oh, I'm experiencing pleasure.
Yep.
When we know it's like that presence, we have this sense of belonging.
Well, I always tell people the phrase, you know, what's lighting you up right now?
Yeah, totally.
And like, even just, you'll notice even in Mary and I's conversations, would be like, you're so lit up talking about this right now, or
Yeah.
whatever it
Yeah.
is. And sometimes you have to even have that awareness for yourself going like, I totally just got all lit up right then. Or like,
Yeah.
I'm getting activated, because that's what this is. It's an activation that happens, and you just feel alive, and just noticing those moments when you feel really alive. And that's what you need to lean more into, right? Like that's that posture where you're like leaning into life.
Yes. I'm just thinking like turned on for life.
Turned on for life. Yeah.
Well, and I was just thinking though, don't be surprised if you notice this longing, you notice this wanting, and then the walls go up.
Yep.
So it's like, oh, I'm starting to feel like this is pleasurable, but then you go into hyper, walls go up, control. I can't actually soften into that. So it's one thing to become aware, this is pleasurable. The second piece is allowing yourself, giving yourself permission to go there, to sort of surrender to that moment, that presence, that sensory experience. And so part of the softening, part of this like little shift, I think, is just allowing yourself, giving yourself permission to open up to it just a little bit more, like staying with it just a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, like the phrase that's coming to me is, what are your vulnerability blocks? Like, because what I hear you saying is when you come right up to the edge of something where you're noticing you're activated and you're turned on for life.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden something shuts down. That's your block.
Right.
And, your blocks can be for a number of reasons, right? It can be your childhood. It can be your religious upbringing. It could be your family history. Who knows what? And honestly, sometimes it doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
But the point is that you've just become aware of your block. That's it. It doesn't mean that's where you have to stop. It might have been where you've stopped up until now.
Yeah.
But the point is that you're noticing, you're becoming aware. And we say this almost every conversation. It's the whole process is about self-discovery and self-awareness. That's what spirituality is. That's what this entire living fully alive is. It's getting to know yourself better and all your hidden parts and all your, blind spots. And so as you're exploring into these, even noticing that insatiable, like needy feeling with pleasure, it's like my hunch is usually those are connected to some trauma. It's some sort of like you're bumping up against the bruise of a trauma that's never been acknowledged.
Yeah.
So when you start feeling that graspy, needy feeling when it comes to pleasure, you're probably bumping it up against something that you haven't even been aware of up until now.
Yeah. It's almost like an unconscious way of trying
Exactly.
to heal the wound.
It's just trying to get your attention that there's some blind spot that is really needing you to address it. And so that kind of takes the shame out of things too.
Right.
You really finally start to get to know yourself in a different way. You're like, okay, there's more work here to do. Or, okay, this is where my blockages are. That's okay. I love and accept myself no matter what. There's that core self-worth, self-love thing.
Yeah.
And here's just another area I've got to like lean into and keep going forward no matter what.
Well, and I think you're hitting on something really important, and we'll kind of start wrapping it up with this, but the idea of the fact that this process is messy. And I think that we all want it to feel like we can put it in a graphic and make it kitschy and make it cute. And the reality is that this work isn't kitschy or cute. I would say with both of us, because we've done this work, we do experience so much more pleasure in life. Like, I think people would actually say about us that like, this is one of our strength zones.
Yeah. This is our favorite subject because we've worked so hard on it.
Yeah. And I just think of, every day I have so much pleasure.
I know. Well, can we be really honest? Let's tell on ourselves. We were trying to come, we have a fabulous person that we're interviewing this month on this. And we were jokingly, but not joking, kind of saying, well, we should interview each other about this because this is our favorite subject. Like,
we do this well.
Yeah.
We do pleasure well.
And the reason is because we have learned that we were disconnected from our bodies.
Yeah.
And we have made it our life's work and mission to live an embodied life.
Well, yeah. And that's why like everything that we do is always beautiful.
Yes.
Like senses
oriented.
Bougie. Okay. Because I mean, it's like, damn it.
Yeah.
I will live a pleasurable life.
I want this human experience to be a pleasurable human experience.
Because
otherwise, why the hell are we here?
Well, I mean, seriously. And like life is painful enough.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much hard. And like where we can, like my house is beautiful. Your house is beautiful. You know, we like experiencing nice things. It's like all of that the indulgence.
Yeah.
We give ourselves permission to do that because it's healthy.
Yeah.
It's safe because we are taking care of ourselves. We are doing our work. So
And
it's
this
not
has
coming.
nothing to do with like money. We're not trying to say spend a bunch of money.
Oh,
in
no.
excess. It's like, what can you do so that you can live fully alive in the life that you are living right now?
Yeah.
And when you are when you're stuck in trauma mode, you're not going to be able to find even the possibilities or have a creative idea about how to bring in more sensory positive sensations into your life. You're stuck. And so just even bringing awareness to the fact that it will come out sideways. Like you'll try to get pleasure from things that are never going to really fully give you that deep sense of pleasure if you aren't honoring the human need to embody your senses.
You gotta deal with the trauma. I mean, I lived years where it came out sideways because I really wanted pleasure, but it was coming out sideways. And it wasn't until I addressed the core wound, the core issue, the core trauma, that now that pleasure is really healthy.
Yeah.
And it feels really safe.
Yeah.
And I can really like give myself to it because it's not going to overtake me. It's not coming out sideways. It's healthy.
Well, there's like destructive things that we do to feel pleasure, and then there's constructive, right? And so what I think I can speak for both of us is we've learned how to cultivate our pleasure life. Like we've learned the healthy way of incorporating pleasure in a healthy way versus grasping for something that is destructive to the bigger picture. Like we have a bigger perspective on what we want our lives to look like. So we know you have to go through certain things and actually pull from the positive ways to bring in pleasure versus these destructive patterns. But hey, it's life. It's not perfect.
No.
I still drink too much sometimes. I still eat too much sometimes.
For sure.
You know what I'm saying? It's just, that's it. You're never going to have a constant state of pleasure.
Yeah. And it's never going to, life is never balanced. No matter how hard you try. Sorry. But we would just encourage anybody who's going through this, obviously, to seek out support through a therapist, through trauma care, EMDR, brain spotting, neurofeedback, recovery, 12-step program, coaching, because we do need the support to get through this. I know that Lindsley and I would be the first to say that we have had incredible, massive, tremendous support to get us to the place where we are now, and still lean on a lot of support as is today.
Yeah.
So y'all, I hope that this conversation has just illuminated this deeper understanding of pleasure so that you can hopefully see that it's not something to be afraid of, but it is something to be mindful of and something to understand where is that core need in you to get the kind of pleasure that you're seeking. Is it coming from a place of trauma? Is it coming from a place of truly wanting to live fully alive? And starting to investigate that in yourself, starting to acknowledge where some work still needs to be done to heal some of those traumas, and ultimately, gently, ever so gently, step by step, open up to more life, to experience life through your senses in 3D, and to let pleasure in. And we're so excited. Next week, we have a fabulous guest who we're going to be interviewing, Kristen Lohr of We Soul Sparks. And we can't wait to talk about just her way that she embodies pleasure. And I think that's going to be a really fun episode for y'all to catch. So any last words there,
No,
Lynn?
that's great. I love it.
All right. Well, guys,
It was pleasurable.
It was so pleasurable. Well, y'all, thank you for listening. We will catch you next week. And until then, remember that the purpose of life is to be grateful, to be great, and to be full. We'll catch y'all next week. Bye. If you love today's episode, make sure to share it with your girlfriends and invite them into this month's topic of pleasure. And if you want to keep the discovery journey going of living more fully alive, check out all my past episodes from the podcast over at maryhyatt.com/show. Plus, you'll be able to grab the show notes for this episode, along with the essential oil recipe of the month that will help you open up to the gift of experiencing pleasure so that you can truly embrace this present moment and be fully alive. Again, that's maryhyatt.com/show. See y'all next week.